So one of the reasons I actually show this, and there's a lot of different ways, by the way, to talk about this. I'm going to focus on talking about this particular pandemic from the perspective this time of resilience, how we can build a world that can weather these kinds of pandemics in the future. And I promise to leave tons of time for questions. So one of the things that I want to emphasize is that near the beginning of 2020, we began to see the genesis of this worldwide pandemic, but unfortunately, the burden of disease and the death toll disproportionately fell to vulnerable people all over the world. And these are people who are both medically vulnerable and also socioeconomically vulnerable. And the problem is that the international bodies that were typically tasked with disease threat assessment and protecting human health were significantly under-resourced. And that's under-resourced in terms of funding, staff, R&D, and they couldn't perform their duties properly. And so I'm basically here to tell you that we as a global society have to do better. We are all interdependent. We are all interconnected. And so I have been chairing and directing actually a global pandemic task force that's developing and elaborating a roadmap, a blueprint to emergently respond to our current pandemic, but also to restructure global health to respond to future pandemics. So that's what I'm going to tell you a little bit about now. Hopefully this lets me change slides. Good. All right. Technology. The World Health Organization was the body that we had in place to serve that function. And this is the body that I'm referring to that has been desperately under-resourced and underfunded. For those of you who don't know, the WHO was established just after World War II in 1948. And according to its founding document, its responsibilities for the directing and coordinating on international health work. But the problem is that a lot of this is on paper. And what I would argue to you is that we need something very different in order to protect us from future pandemics. We need the equivalent of an early warning system. This is a hurricane tracker from NOAA. And if we had to wait till hurricanes hit, we as a society would be in trouble. So we have systems in place for surveillance, basically the equivalent of smoke alarms that tell us, oh, there's a tripwire that's been detected and now you need to act. Now, one of the other pieces of this is while you have sort of a threat assessment device, you also need to develop what I refer to as a global immune system. So we're going to talk a little bit today about what these two pieces might mean. And the first place I will go to is this idea of healthcare capacity. Now, I think many of you are aware of the fact that our healthcare capacity is important, not just at a national level, but globally. And it's because without adequate healthcare, we can't actually prevent the spread of this disease. So one of the things that would be extraordinarily helpful is if we had some kind of universal healthcare from cradle to grave. And that really would have helped to avert the worst of this pandemic. And this is a viewpoint, no matter how you would fund it, that's really shared by physicians all over the world. Now, there's some other things that we could do in order to increase our capacity. And one of them is the search for a universal flu vaccine. So what does that actually mean? Well, the influenza virus basically has these spike proteins that all of you have come to have heard about, and you can see them right here. There are these spikes and they seem to be topped with these round balls. Now, part of the spike constantly evolves and mutates, and it's the reason that we need to keep getting a new flu vaccine every season. But there are parts of the spike protein that don't change. And there has been an ongoing quest to find a universal vaccine, antibodies that bind to the part of these coronaviruses that do not continue to mutate. And actually recently, towards the end of last year, one of these universal flu vaccines just went into clinical trials. So it's actually seeking FDA approval. And if we could develop such a universal flu vaccine, a universal coronavirus vaccine, we might be able to prevent future outbreaks by vaccinating our populations. One of the problems with vaccines, however, is that countries are beginning to get a bit, what's the word for it? A little proprietary, right? So if there's a vaccine that is being developed by a company in the United States, another one in the Netherlands, and one in China, People want to see their own communities vaccinated first before they make that vaccine available to the world. The second problem is that vaccines are typically developed by big pharma. And big pharma, and there's no judgment here, for better or for worse, they're looking to make a return on their investment. They put a lot of R&D behind this. But if we make vaccinating people commensurate with their ability to pay, you can see once again how the most vulnerable in the world will not be vaccinated. And wherever you stand on this, we are only as safe as the most vulnerable people in our population. So this particular organization, CEPI, which is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, has created essentially the equivalent of a global vaccine fund, and it has both public and private partnerships behind it. And their aim is, when vaccines are discovered and developed, to get this distribution out to the planet without concern for profit being the motive. Now, I want to sort of reorient you to where we are today. This is a series of graphs that I often show every time I give a talk on this subject. And I want you to first see this date. So this is one of the very first ones, March 15th, 2020. This is the day before San Francisco and the San Francisco Bay Area went into lockdown. And as I was giving this talk, I actually didn't know we were going into lockdown. And you can see that the total number of cases in the world is about 167,000 cases. Also, take a look at who's at the top of the list. This is back when China was dominating the list, 81,000 cases in the world. And the United States was somewhere in like 7th place. Now you move a few weeks later to March 22nd. China's still at the top of the list, but the US moved to number 3. And this is, by the way, when Europe was really being hard hit. So you can see that Italy has sort of moved into slot number 2, but about 340,000 cases in the world. 1 month later, we had jumped to 1.75 million cases in the world. The United States is strongly in the lead. Here we are, May 5th, 3.6 million cases in the world. The US is still dominating. And as you go through this, here we are today, 11.9 million cases in the world. The United States has more cases than almost anywhere else, 3 million. Following closely behind us is Brazil with 1.7 million. Then you see India, Russia, Peru, Chile. That should let you know that we are probably the only really developed country at the top of this list, but you can see how this sort of wave of virus has now moved to more vulnerable countries as well. But we really, we do need to do something to get this under control. So how can we build in that kind of resilience? So one possibility is a better surveillance system. And what do I mean by this? There are lots of ways of doing surveillance. And here is a very interesting one. And I'm not sure how many of you are aware that we track viruses this way. But this is the epidemiology of the virus sequences. So basically, all a virus is a bunch of code. It's a bunch of letters strung together, packaged in a protein shell. And that thing doesn't even live until it infects a true host. So either a human host or a bat or some other kind of animal. And then what happens is the protein structure begins to break apart, and that virus injects itself into our cells, and then we turn into factories for creating more copies of it. And what you can do is you can sequence from different people who have been infected, or even by looking at things like our soil and wastewater, you can actually sequence the virus's genome and track where it has been and where it has come from by looking at changes in that viral RNA sequence. So that is one way of doing surveillance. And an interesting use case of this is that while we have been talking a lot about testing issues, there are very new tests that are on the horizon. This particular test, which is based on a technology called Crispr, is one in which you can almost use the equivalent in like Microsoft Word of the command find function to deliberately seek out regions of a virus. So the first thing I want to ask is, how many of you have ever heard of CRISPR? I can see some of your faces on my screen in gallery mode, but has everybody heard of CRISPR? Do people know what this is? So I see a couple of no's. Okay, so for those of you who I'm insulting, I apologize, but I'm going to assume that not everybody does know what this is. CRISPR is one of the biggest biotechnologies to arrive in almost a century. CRISPR is a technology that allows us to edit the human genome. And it allows us to edit the human genome because we essentially reappropriated an immune system defense mechanism for bacteria against invading viruses. What would happen is a virus would come in and it would infect the bacteria, and they don't have antibodies like humans do. So what did they have? They had a bunch of enzymes sitting around, and those enzymes needed to find out what was foreign. So they would search for sequences of DNA or RNA that looked different than their own. And that's how CRISPR evolved in nature. It was essentially an enzyme system that was programmed to look for particular sequences. And once that sequence was found, the enzyme could bind to it, and then it could do a number of things. So you can now cut DNA or RNA. You can replace misspellings in the base pair code. So this is being used to treat diseases like sickle cell anemia. But you could potentially also create superhumans. That is a talk for a different day. But you can re-engineer parts of the human race doing this. You can rewrite the code of life. You can use the functions, however, for finding to also find foreign invaders in the human system. And so CRISPR-based detection platforms are now coming into vogue, and they're undergoing FDA trials right now. And you can detect much smaller amounts of viruses in a human, and you can actually turn this into a home test. So you could almost have a home CRISPR test like you have a home pregnancy test with a color change. So something like this. And once you get that, that color change, you actually know that you've detected part of the virus. But a really interesting use of CRISPR is the enzyme itself. You can almost treat it as a cartridge, and you can use it to sort of build a detection system in which you slot new pieces of DNA or RNA as new pandemics are discovered. And so you can sort of amass a stockpile of tests and then just slot in the new viral RNA sequence you're searching for if you detect a new pandemic. So this is a way for us to maintain our testing capacity, our surge capacity in the face of a new viral threat. So what else might you be able to do? Well, telemonitoring and active sensing is another way to hedge your bets against pandemics. So as many of you know, it's really difficult to go to a hospital now. And if you feel like you have symptoms, the question becomes, are you allowed to get a test? Do you go see a doctor? Do you do a visit through a telemedicine platform? Well, we can appropriate things like wearable devices, things like your Fitbit, in order to detect whether or not things are changing within your vital signs. There was a study that was done recently with Scripps Research Institute in San Diego and with Fitbit. And what they found is that if they looked at the deviation of a person's heart rate, if their heart rate began to get elevated relative to their own baseline heart rate, it was a strong predictor that that person had COVID-19. And they compared it to positive and negative COVID-19 tests. So we might be able to use wearable devices to tell us if we have been infected in the population. Another possibility is to use different systems that we could place around the house to do things like machine-based vision and spectral monitoring. So imagine if you wanted to be able to monitor someone's temperature. You can actually use an infrared system to scan a person's skin and look for changes, and knowing what their baseline is, you can actually tell if they have mounted a fever. So we could use these kinds of systems as scanning systems. And finally, we can interconnect a number of these devices in order to do this kind of active sensing. And let me give you an example of such a sensor. This happens to be a multimodal sensor called the Sky sensor. It's a patch that you can literally stick on yourself and pick up 5 different vital signs. So rather than having to go to a doctor's office and have yourself connected to a pulse oximeter and 5 EKG leads and a blood pressure cuff, you can get it with an all-in-one sensor that you can stick on your chest wall. And this kind of technology is going to make it much easier to monitor people outside of hospital systems. Here's another very interesting one. This one actually comes from Australia. A colleague of mine has been developing this tiny, tiny little patch that you can insert into the skin. And it detects when people's immune systems are going haywire, that thing that is called a cytokine storm that might actually lead to a really, really severe or dangerous outcome. So you can constantly monitor people for this impending cytokine storm and then intervene before it happens. This is an interesting possibility. So there are Swiss researchers who are looking at passive sensors to detect viral RNA from the air. And this introduces this new idea. The other thing was active sensing. This is passive sensing. Can we instrument our planet in order to detect viral threats before they happen? Now, let me give you another really interesting one that you may not have ever thought of. This is essentially passive sensing for your sewage water. So these two women that you see up here, they basically spun off a company from MIT. And originally what they were doing is they were sampling sewage water and they were testing it for opiates. So they could look for hotspots in the opiate crisis without directly linking it to any one individual. Well, it turns out people who are infected with COVID-19, even if they're completely asymptomatic and never develop symptoms, they will start shedding virus in their feces 6 days before they ever develop a symptom. And you can collect this sewage water and you can you can amplify these viral sequences, and you can find hotspots of COVID-19 in places where you don't even have tests. And they have done a study in which they actually compared in a suburb outside of Boston what they found by testing for COVID-19 viral RNA in the sewage water versus the number of positive tests. And the number of cases that came up in the sewage water were about 200,000, whereas there were only 10,000 identified cases. So this tells you that this has the potential of both preserving privacy, but identifying hotspots 6 days in advance before they even occur. Another example is smart toilets. How many of you are aware of the existence of smart toilets? So not a lot of people. How many of you have heard of the microbiome? Anybody has heard of that? These are basically a series of gut microbes that basically line your entire GI tract. You have more gut bacteria than you have human cells, okay? So they're actually the majority in this symbiotic relationship. And these gut bacteria help to metabolize so much of what you pass through as your food. And in the process, they often determine whether you develop autoimmune disease, whether you're going to get Parkinson's, whether or not you are obese or extremely thin. They determine a number of things. So we're finding that there's an incredible link between the microbiome and human health, and that you can alter human health potentially by changing that microbiome. So these smart toilets were developed in order to, I mean, right now you can go to the bathroom and you can buy a kit and you can take a sample of your stool and stick it in a vial and send it to a company, and they'll tell you what your microbiome looks like. How about if your toilet could do that for you? You don't have to collect any kind of stool samples, but the toilet can actually analyze everything coming out, everything from blood in your stool to what you're eating, to what your microbiome looks like. Well, we can reappropriate that and have your smart toilets look for things like shed virus, and you yourself would find out from your stool whether or not you had become a carrier of the disease. So that's another really interesting possibility. Again, these are all passive kinds of sensors. Here's another interesting one. So it turns out NASA has launched a number of satellites in order to track animal migrations on the surface of the planet. And they have incredibly good resolution, so good that you can actually see changes in the skin temperature of animals migrating on the planet. So what might this do for you? Well, for one thing, one of the reasons we may be having different viruses that we have no immunity to jumping from animal to human host is because animals and humans are now encroaching upon one another's environments. You can actually see that through migration and detect when there's that kind of encroachment before it becomes a problem. But this change in skin temperature, they're saying, could even be used to do things like analyze for things like bird flu. Birds get the flu as well. The avian flu, the swine flu were two of the deadliest flus that humans ever experienced. We're still arguing about what the death rate is for COVID. The death rate for something like avian or swine flu, if you were to get it, was 80 to 90%, right? So very, very different. COVID is nothing compared to some of these other kinds of flus. So being able to track animals who are their hosts would be very valuable. Now, in the process of tracking, I don't know, how many of you have heard of contact tracing? God, I have a small set. There's a few of you who have heard of it. How many of you are worried about contact tracing? Surveillance, privacy? I see a few people shaking heads. Let me explain the concept behind contact tracing. So contact tracing essentially says, if I have a smartphone or a piece of hardware and I am positive for COVID, somehow that device is going to identify me and everyone I have been in contact with. Now, there's two ways to do this. If you are in a place like Singapore, China, etc., that information is sent to the central government. Everybody is contacted that has ever had contact with you, and they are quarantined without question. They have no choice in the matter. All right, so that is a centralized contact tracing system. And for better or for worse, when you use a more autocratic approach, you actually contain the spread of illness. Now, there's another way of doing this, and that is to actually have everyone's smartphone connected via Bluetooth to one another. And in this case, let's say I go and get a COVID test and I test positive. I can enter that information into my phone. My phone has an app on it. And what it does is, in a way that's hashed, in a way that protects my privacy, so nobody finds out who it is. Everybody that was within 6 feet of me for about 15 minutes in the Trader Joe's I was at yesterday will get a little beep on their phone, and they know that they would have been exposed to somebody with COVID-19. They won't know who it is, but they'll know that they were exposed. And that enables them to do the right thing, which is to self-quarantine, to mask up, to basically protect their family and loved ones, especially the vulnerable people. So this is a different approach. This is more of an American and European approach to doing contact tracing. That one developed between Apple and Google is based on Stanford's COVID Watch. This one, MIT, also has a contact tracing program that's also privacy oriented. It's called SafePaths. My company has basically a partnership with them because we are trying to build a global immune system. And the director of this program is testifying before Congress this morning exactly about what SafePaths can do for the United States, how it can also help it open up. And again, I cannot sort of overemphasize how important this idea of privacy first is, that we should be able to protect our civil liberties while engaging in things that help us act as public health officials. So essentially what we're trying to go towards is this idea that we can create an internet of things, of people, of resources, of devices that could help us passively and actively monitor our planet so that we basically have a decentralized network. And by decentralized network, I truly mean decentralized. That means any one of you can become a data source. You know, Stanford Hospital can become a data source. But let's say that some of the original doctors in Wuhan, China, who began to notice that something was up and there was a really strange pneumonia-like illness taking place, they wouldn't have to have gone through a central hierarchy to get the signal out. They could have passed it through one of the nodes in this decentralized network after their data was authenticated. And perhaps the world could have acted on this sooner. Now, why is this important? Well, there's a different way to do this, and this is another option. And this is true. This is what happened in China. And essentially what they did was they took drones and they mounted cameras and microphones on them. And they flew the drones around in order to surveil their own citizens. And this is, in my opinion, quite a dangerous development. And if we as a society don't do better, we may find that we end up having to sacrifice a lot of our democratic ideals in order to secure public health. And I think that is not what we want to do. There are some other things we can do also to build pandemic resilience. This is an organization. the CEO is a friend of mine, Jack Sim. It is, and I kid you not, it is called the World Toilet Organization. Apparently, to get the initials WTO, they had to fight the WTO about its trademark issues. But they go around the world building toilets. Why? Because lack of sanitation, waterborne diseases are one of the #1 killers of people across the planet. And it's a great way of spreading infections, and infections spread through this kind of bad sanitation. They know no boundaries. What are some of the other issues? Well, overcrowding. I mean, how do we deal with refugee populations, migrant populations, even, for instance, people at our own US border? These are breeding grounds for viruses and for basically these kinds of infections to spread. We've recently seen what's been happening in our prison populations with the spread of coronavirus. Another one is providing clean water. This is not just a sanitation issue. This is not just so they can drink. I was contacted by a group in Africa when all of this broke out, and they said, oh, it's all well and good. You're telling us that we should be washing our hands for 20 seconds. We have no running water. Now, if you think that this is a problem in the rest of the world, it turns out that this is also a problem within the United States' own borders. There are places in rural America, West Virginia, places in Arizona, Colorado, where there are similar problems. They don't have broadband, they don't have running water in some places. This is a huge problem with our indigenous people. So for instance, like Sioux, Navajo, Pima reservations, many of them don't have running water. They're also breeding grounds for this virus to spread. Navajo Nation has one of the highest per capita rates of viral infection. So providing water security is something that we can do for the planet. Food security is another one. In fact, probably hunger will, as a result of COVID-19, will kill more people around the world than the virus actually will. But food security leads to health and well-being. And this is another way that we can actually stave off the spread of pandemics. Finally, a few others. Climate change. Remember, I talked about the encroachment of humans and animals upon one another's space and territory, and this is how a lot of this is spreading. So if you want to decrease zoonotic spread, you'll actually have to have animals and humans staying in the habitats in which they evolved. There's another problem with climate change. So it turns out as the ice caps are melting, there are viruses that have been trapped in there for tens of millions of years that no human or animal has been exposed to that's living today. And therefore we have no immune response. And even of those tens of thousands of viruses that will be unmelted in this permafrost, even if only 2 or 3 of them prove to be deadly, that's 2 or 3 too many. How we manage our food supply. So the way in which we raise animals in factory farming, and that's more of a Western thing. In places like China, Vietnam, East Asia, it's more the sort of these wet markets. But all of this also creates conditions in which there is zoonotic spread of virus. So if we want to prevent future pandemics, we need to prevent this kind of overcrowding and this kind of merging of human and animal. And interestingly enough, there are new technologies coming online for this. This might sound kind of weird to people, but in addition to plant-based meats, which are not really meat at all, and which some people don't feel like taste like meat at all, you can actually take stem cells from animals, which doesn't hurt them in any way. You don't have to grow them up to eventually slaughter them and take the muscle for meat. You can grow, using the stem cells, you can grow animal muscle in biochemical reactions and actually create burgers, steaks, chicken, sushi, whatever you need to. This technology has not yet fully scaled. It's not yet at a price point that we could deliver it to the entire population. But in addition to being a viable source of protein in the future for people who don't have money, this may be another way for us to actually avoid catching viruses from animals that should not have been penned up in that way. And as I close, I want to give one final push for this idea that we are only as strong as the most vulnerable amongst us. I belong to an organization called One Shared World, in which we actually have a global declaration for interdependence. And it's something that you can go online and read and sign if it's something you're interested in. But I cannot emphasize enough that on this planet, we as humans are completely interconnected, and how we care for those amongst us that are the most vulnerable will not only reflect on us as humans, but it will actually mean our safety. All right, so with that, I'm going to stop. I will stop screen sharing and then try and take some questions. And you can ask me anything. You can ask me about vaccines, viruses, whatever.
Well, I have a question for you, more of a comment than anything else. And that was when we were seeing the rise of the numbers of the virus in the world.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing that I noticed on all of those numbers, everybody was rising except China. Over the entire time, it stayed at 84,000. It's like they were not reporting anymore. So how can you trust anything that the Chinese are telling you, given the fact that they don't report?
First of all, I'm not sure you can. I don't know if you also know that Jair Bolsonaro, you know, president of Brazil, did something very similar recently. He actually decided to stop reporting numbers because it looked bad, right? So he didn't want it to look bad. And the scientists were up in arms because they said, how can we do epidemiology and analyze data if we don't have this? All of this is true. You can't. You know, we go into this blueprint into much greater detail, but we have a lot of people who are involved with this organization who have been part of Central Intelligence, who have been part of organizations like the United Nations, et cetera. We have problems because governments have lots of competing pressures. They have optics, they have trust issues, there are all kinds of political issues. This is why, if you remember when I mentioned this idea of creating decentralized networks where information could get into places where people could act on the data without it having to go through a centralized system, this is precisely why decentralized networks are so important. Can you trust all the numbers coming out? No, you can't. And they're not only dependent on who reports, but who tests, right? So if you don't test, you won't find anything. So there's a number of reasons that you can't 100% trust these numbers. But I will say that if we were to develop sort of this network-based approach to creating a global immune system, you would see a lot more information coming in that was not directly reported by governments.
So do you think that Elon Musk's Starlink is going to have an impact on that?
I think Starlink and any other kind of sort of a satellite network will have two possible impacts. By the way, I just want to say that, you know, as much as I'm a tech lover and I have used satellite data for all kinds of research, I think this is a lot. This might actually blot out a lot of the sky as we know it and change the human experience with their own planet. But that aside, how might it help? Two ways. One is through those passive monitoring systems that I was describing to you. The more satellites that we have that can actually track conditions on the Earth, whether they're things like climate, currents, disease spread, human migration, population migration, where lights are in cities on the planet. They can look at things through so many different spectral lenses. So yes, absolutely. So the more satellites we have monitoring our planet, the more we have created this early warning system and contributed to the global immune system. But the second piece of it is something that I had explored back in the 90s, and that was so much of the planet doesn't have broadband. Many of them don't even have smartphones. So one of the ways in which you can not only monitor people on the planet, but deliver healthcare to people is to bypass infrastructure requirements. So you don't need lines, you don't need cable, you don't need fiber optic. You just need a direct line of sight to a satellite. And in that way, people can communicate and people can also get their healthcare. So I think that these kinds of architectures will solve the problem in multiple ways. Oh, anybody can ask questions, so
this is
feel free.
Mark Nakajima, and in my daily life, I do a lot of consultation about toilets. So It's reassuring to know that in the future, I'll have an opportunity to explain the rebooting of their toilet and maybe how to Wi-Fi connect it.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, you know, people don't like to talk about toilets, but our waste is a window into our bodies. So there's a lot we can learn there.
I don't necessarily enjoy talking about toilets either, but it's kind of part of my business.
Well, just a comment. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Richard Kidd, and I really got a lot out of your presentation. And for those Rotarians that I mentioned earlier, and I think you might want to get Rich's article from Yale because it's a good prelude to what you heard here today.
Would you actually put that in the chat? I'd love to look at what you're talking about as well.
Technology is not my first love here. Before you came on, I shared with them that my son Rich had just been published in Yale Insight on how the Army's stance is on the virus, and when the Army first found out about it and what they have been doing along, and brought him up to date. And for your information, my son is the Undersecretary of the Army for Sustainability.
Oh, that's fascinating. And he has the same name as you said, Richard?
Yes, he's the fourth. I'm the third.
You're the third. Maybe you should put us in touch. We actually, we're actually, the company I've co-founded, it's called Plexus. We have a network that is building a decentralized network to integrate all these signals. If you want to put it into more military terms, it's more like a command and control system. And the DoD has been really interested in what we're building, and Air Force. So if you think the Army might also be, that's because we are working with the armed forces because we're also trying to protect our servicemen and women. But they also have a role to play, I think, in global defense. And this is another kind of global defense.
I'll try to figure out how to get this into the system chat with you, but I will pass. I got your information email.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you so much.
Dr. Chander, do you believe that this COVID-19 is a new seasonal flu? It sounds like there's already multiple strains.
Okay, so when you say a new seasonal flu, are you referring to something that will wax and wane or come and go? Or are you asking if, in terms of symptom severity?
More that it'll come and go, that we're not going to be able to necessarily eradicate this.
I think you may be right. In a different presentation I put up slides that have shown, like, for instance, the waves of the Spanish flu. The reason Spanish flu was able to be contained is we didn't have the degree of migration that we do. And now with globalization, but even within the United States, the number of people we come into contact with, it's until we had like something like a vaccine, it would be really difficult to develop any kind of herd immunity. I don't know yet whether the virus is going to completely, whether it's going to be waves and seasonal, or whether it's just going to be constant, because this virus has shown no sensitivity to temperature anywhere on the planet, right? So flu typically, the influenza A and B, they typically show themselves in fall and early winter. And that does not seem to be the case here, because if you look at the range of latitudes that the virus has expressed itself, we're not seeing that. And we're also still within that first wave. It is possible, it might be seasonal, it's possible it will remain constant, or it's possible that we will somewhat flatten the curve, get it under control a bit, and then something will happen and then it will reignite a second wave, much as the Spanish flu did. So one thing we haven't really talked as much about is whether or not this virus is also going to mutate. So we already know there are at least 2 distinct strains. In fact, there are many more, but that might actually have biological relevance. So the second strain that has been described is much more contagious, in fact, and that's probably the strain that evolved and came from Europe. It's not clear that it is more virulent, meaning more deadly. And typically when something's more contagious, it's usually less deadly because if it killed its host, it wouldn't be able to jump to the next one. So we don't even know this about the virus. And we also don't know if we were to develop a vaccine, whether the virus would mutate enough that it wouldn't even matter. And within, say, several months to a couple of years, it'll come back in a slightly mutated form, and either our own natural antibodies we developed or a vaccine won't work anymore. All of the above are possible.
That's really terrifying.
It's terrifying, but we can do a lot. Let's take China out of this, because I know a lot of people don't trust any of the numbers coming out of there. So let's just take them out of this. But if you look at what's actually happened in Europe and some other countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, etc., the simple act, for instance, of wearing masks, if 80% of the population wore masks, this thing would probably die out for a bit, for quite a long bit, until we got a vaccine. And so there are just really simple things we could do to help contain it. There are some countries that never went into lockdown and don't have a problem. They're open and functioning. So that's actually a message I'd really like to get out there. I don't know if you know people who are concerned about masks or think it's a violation of potentially private, like civil liberties or something, but mask wearing is one of the #1 things that we can do to stop spreading this, because there's a lot of asymptomatic spreaders out there. And they've actually done modeling. If 80% of people wore masks, the thing would be almost gone in terms of new active cases in the United States. And from my perspective, I would much rather have someone ask me to wear a mask to protect other people and maybe not spread it, versus surveilling me. And I think that if people are really worried about like expression and First Amendment, masks pale in comparison to being tracked by your government, to being tracked by other entities. And that's the thing we don't really want to give up, right? We want that right. So it's a short-term trade-off. And, you know, I would highly recommend that if you know people who are on the fence about it, maybe helping them to understand why it's so important. Any other questions? You can ask me anything.
Well, I watch a lot of television these days since I can't go anywhere. And on TV, I can't believe some of these group gatherings that I see, like on the beaches and riots and protesters. And I just don't see how we're ever going to get it controlled if people don't start obeying the so-called rules. Do you have any comments on this?
I do, and they're not easy. So with respect to just, okay, the easy one for me is things like gathering at the beach for spring break. That to me is just absolutely ludicrous, right? Because what are you really doing for short-term gain? You're potentially preventing the country from reopening in the future and life going back to semi-normal, right? So that to me seems just strange and weird. And I think it's partially this, especially if you're asymptomatic or you're not in one of those vulnerable populations, it is very easy. Remember being young where you feel like you're invincible and nothing can hurt you. And you cannot imagine a world in which you'd pass away. You don't know a lot of people who have passed away. And so I think this is partially a mentality that's associated with being young. That being said, young people in other countries, for instance, in Europe, have done a better job. And the question is, what's wrong with our messaging? Why can't we get the right messaging out? When it comes to things like protests, that is a difficult one to comment on. I will tell you, #1, that unlike the beaches, I've seen 80–90% of protesters at least wearing masks. They're not socially distanced, but they're wearing masks. When you feel like for some reason your civil liberties are being threatened, then people begin asking and making other kinds of trade-offs. So I won't comment on the political situation behind that, but I think it's a different calculus. And people who are out there maybe protesting for their rights, they really do see this also as a matter of life and death for them, versus people who are at the beach or at a bar. And I think that those might be slightly different things. But in every case, whether or not you're able to be socially distanced, wearing masks is one of the #1 things you can do. And outdoors is certainly safer than being indoors. There seems to be no question about this in terms of the science.
Thank you.
Looks like somebody, is it Chuck and Betty Pritchard?
Yes. Does the mask protect me or does it protect other people?
Oh, great question. I have a really good graphic. I could try and share my screen on this one, but let me just say both. There's a really good graphic that shows what happens depending on one or the other person wearing the mask. So if you wear a mask and somebody else doesn't, you are absolutely protecting them. If you and the other person are wearing a mask, it's really unlikely that either of you would actually get it. If you are not wearing a mask and someone else is not wearing a mask, you have a very high likelihood of getting it. And if you personally are not wearing a mask, but they are, your risk goes down significantly. So the mask in general does more to protect the other person, but it can also protect you. And I'll tell you the difference as a doctor. When I'm in the hospital, I work in the operating room. Okay, so for my entire career, I have been wearing masks. And the masks that we typically wear are surgical masks. They're the ones that you often see with the ear loops, and they're made of a synthetic material, but they're not the really intense like N95 ones, right? We wear those to protect the patient from ourselves so that we don't breathe into their wounds and cause an infection that they wouldn't have gotten if it weren't for us. However, let's say in the past, this is even pre-COVID, let's say that a patient comes in and they test positive for TB, tuberculosis. We put them in a negative pressure room, and now instead of wearing a surgical mask, I wear an N95 mask. And now that protects me. Okay, that protects me in a way that the surgical mask is not good enough because it has all these gaps. It's not interwoven enough to block all the fine particles that could hit the mask. So the answer is both, but if you're trying to protect others, surgical and cloth masks are pretty good. If you're really trying to protect yourself, it's an N95. And that will block almost everything coming in, 95%.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Chlorine has been used for years as a disinfectant. So we hear a lot of people saying, well, why can't I go swimming in a chlorinated swimming pool? Comment?
So I would only comment that I have seen people, some people saying, well, chlorine isn't enough to inactivate it. I think it's all about conditions, right? So chlorine is good for killing some bacteria in pools. We don't have studies that show that it kills coronavirus. We might have those at some point, but I think until you actually do the study and see its germicidal potential, like what's its killing ratio, right? You won't really have an answer to that question. So I could make up an answer, but that wouldn't serve anybody, right? So the one problem is if we imagine it and think, well, it kills this, so probably it should kill that. You can't 100% say. If I had to give my best guess, if you are breathing underwater, it's probably safer than, for somebody else who's underwater with you. But typically in public pools, people are often, I actually do laps in pools. People are typically splashing in pools and yelling and screaming and playing like games. They're really likely to spit on each other, breathe on each other, etc. So I would say that public pools don't seem particularly safe. I would not put myself there. I'm not swimming right now. I refuse to swim because I'm afraid that I would be subject to getting it. So, and you can't wear a mask when you swim.
Well, I did manage to get that Yale contact in the chat, and I got it in wrong, and it has already been corrected.
You're wonderful. Thank you for doing that. I really appreciate it. But yeah, tell your son what we're working on, and that we are working with, we're working on with granting agencies for all of the major divisions of the armed forces. So, and also with DOD. So, it'd be very interesting if he wants to have a chat at some point. I'd enjoy that. Let's see if I can put this somewhere. Okay. So any other questions? Do you guys have like how to make a vaccine questions or anything else?
One of the members that does not have a microphone asked about transmission through mosquitoes.
Transmission through mosquitoes. So in order for something to be transmitted through a mosquito or any animal, that animal has to be a host for it. So for instance, let's say I were infected with COVID-19 and a mosquito bit me in my backyard, and then it flew over to my neighbor's yard, and then the same mosquito bit them. Well, if I had dengue, it's pretty likely that my neighbor would get dengue. But so far, we have not seen that the mosquito serves as a host for COVID-19. In other words, if the mosquito bit me, neither would it get sick, but nor would it incorporate the virus into its own cells and be able to transmit it. So to our knowledge, the mosquito is not a vector. Our knowledge could change if we began to find in certain areas that there were hotspots that seem to only be associated with mosquitoes. People would probably start looking at it. But it seems like mammals are really the hosts. So bats, pangolins, things like that.
Dr. Chander.
Josh?
What do you think a realistic like timeline for vaccine could be?
I think the earliest you might expect a vaccine would be towards the end of the year, and a few things have to go right. So for those of you, how many of you guys know about clinical trials and how they're run?
Yes.
So we at least have a few people, right? So there's like a phase 1, and phase 1 is a safety trial, right? So we want to make sure that what we're giving someone to treat a disease doesn't hurt them more than, or unnecessarily kill them, maim them, cause morbidity, do something bad. Phase 2 is once you've shown that it's safe to give to humans, then you want to test it in a very small group of humans to see if it works, okay? So that's the efficacy. Phase 3 is a much larger version. So if whatever it is, like in this case, a vaccine gets through phase 1 and phase 2, then they want to test in a really large population of humans to really see whether or not it can prevent the disease. Now, there's a couple of things to say about this. One, phase 3 trials for vaccines are hard to do because you have to also kind of wait for a person to naturally come in contact with the virus in order to see if it prevented them getting it. So there is some interesting talk about, there are people, and they're mostly young people, but all over the world who are saying that there's actually an international convention on saying you cannot force people to be exposed to something dangerous in the name of a clinical trial. But they're trying to voluntarily step up and say, I'll not only get vaccinated, but you can deliberately expose me to COVID-19 so that you can do the trial much more quickly. And you guys can see how if, let's say I'm in the vaccine arm and then I don't get sick, and you don't know if I didn't get sick because I didn't bump into anybody with COVID and get exposed, or I did bump into people, but the vaccine protected me. So this is what they're trying to jumpstart. So that's problem one with vaccine trials, and that's why typically they've taken a long time. What we have going for us in our favor is that vaccines are being developed with a kind of rapidity we have never seen before. So the time to development of the first
program, much to speak of.
Sorry? Oh, I was saying that when the viral sequence was finally released from Wuhan, China in January, Moderna, which is one of the companies that's building a genetic vaccine, I mean, it was almost like, it's almost like you just transmitted a life form down a computer line, down the internet, they received it on the other end, and they started assembling parts of, they basically started appropriating parts of the virus's genome to create a vaccine to inject into humans. And they did that in 42 days. And typically that process takes 5 to 6 years, right, to create antibodies that can be tested in humans. So I think that this era of biotech has really jump-started vaccine production. There are DNA vaccines by Inovio. There are mRNA vaccines by companies like Moderna. And then there are even antibodies that have been developed, but they're being developed in new ways. like doing things like using artificial intelligence, right? So you look at the structure of this spike protein, and then you can actually sort of screen through existing libraries of antibodies to see what might bind to it by sort of harnessing artificial intelligence and computational power, something even 2 to 3 years ago would have been very difficult. That approach is also being used for therapeutics. So all that said and done, Moderna is in trial. There are actually, I think, 12 or 13 viral candidates. Moderna is probably the closest. They have shown both safety and efficacy so far. And they're in phase 3 trials, and there are definitely a few of them. And if any of them really truly succeed, maybe by December we could see something, or it may be as late as, say, summer next year. So that was a long-winded way of answering your question, but it goes a little bit into vaccine development and testing.
Thank you. Do you agree with the thought that it may take like over a year to get the supply enough to give it to everybody?
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. That was why I alluded to, but I didn't really embellish on this idea of a surge capacity. There's a couple things that have to happen when, I mean, you first need the vaccine, but then a lot of people don't realize there's a lot of reagents that go into making vaccines. And so you need to have an intact supply chain, right? And then you need the manufacturing facilities. So both of these things, one of the things that a lot of us argue for is that if the planet wants to be ready for a future, not just COVID, but any future pandemic, we need to have these kinds of vaccine manufacturing capabilities ready to go online. It's kind of like, again, if you compare it to threat assessment, it's kind of like having a standing army or a defense system, right? You need to be able to mobilize them quickly. So we have them even in times of peace. We need that same kind of surge capacity for development of vaccines and other therapeutics in order to make sure that we're ready if we're hit with something else in the future. And actually, I was on a panel recently with the Atlantic Council that was actually called Trust in Medical Supply Chain. And it was an entire panel just on how you build trust and resilience in those kinds of supply chains to protect us against these kinds of future threats. Other questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Chander. This is an amazing program. I think we could all sit and listen to you educate us for hours. This was really good timing. Thank you for joining us.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me and hosting me. So thank you.